What if I told you America once underestimated India so badly that it changed the balance of global power? For decades, Washington looked at India and saw nothing but poverty, chaos, and instability. After independence in 1947, India was dismissed as irrelevant, too slow, too messy, too poor to ever matter on the world stage. Instead, America chose to invest in others. Pakistan became its frontline Cold War ally, China was seen as the big economic bet, and Europe remained the center of trade and strategy. But here's the twist: those very choices backfired. While America was busy arming Pakistan, India crushed it in the 1971 war and liberated Bangladesh in just 13 days. When the U.S. slapped sanctions on India for its nuclear tests, New Delhi doubled down on self-reliance, eventually emerging as a nuclear power anyway. And when American corporations ignored India's market, they turned instead to China, a decision the U.S. is still paying for today. Meanwhile, India quietly transformed. It built one of the world's largest tech workforces, became the pharmacy of the world, modernized its economy, and turned its vast democracy into a magnet for global investors. Today, Indian Americans lead some of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley. India itself is the fastest growing major economy, and Washington suddenly wants the partnership it once rejected. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly how misjudging India cost America influence, markets, and even potential allies. And you lines understand why underestimating India may go down as one of the costliest mistakes in U.S. foreign policy history. Cold War missteps, choosing Pakistan over India. In the early years of the Cold War, Washington had a choice to make. On one side was India, the world's largest democracy, newly independent and experimenting with a parliamentary system of governance. On the other side was Pakistan, smaller but strategically located near the Soviet Union, the Persian Gulf, and China. The U.S. bet heavily on Pakistan, and in hindsight, it was one of its costliest strategic mistakes. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Pakistan became a frontline ally. It joined U.S.-backed defense pacts like SEATO Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and CENTO Central Treaty Organization. Billions in military and financial aid flowed into Islamabad, while New Delhi received only lukewarm diplomatic attention. America saw India's policy of non-alignment as unreliability, failing to grasp that India's democratic experiment was in itself a natural alignment with the West. This miscalculation became glaring in 1971 during the Bangladesh Liberation War, when Pakistan's military launched brutal campaigns in East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh. Millions of refugees fled into India. New Delhi intervened militarily, crushing Pakistan's forces in just 13 days, one of the fastest and most decisive wars in modern history. The U.S., however, sided with Pakistan. President Nixon even sent the USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal to intimidate India. The message was clear: Washington valued Islamabad's strategic position over India's democratic principles. The cost was enormous. America alienated India for decades. Distrust grew so deep that India turned decisively toward the Soviet Union for military and diplomatic support. Moscow became India's most reliable partner, supplying arms, supporting its nuclear ambitions, and backing it at the United Nations. By misjudging India's potential, Washington lost its chance to secure a long-term democratic ally in Asia, one that could have balanced both China and the Soviet Union much earlier: nuclear sanctions and strategic distrust. If the Cold War choices planted mistrust, America's response to India's nuclear ambitions cemented it. In 1974, India conducted its first nuclear test, codenamed Smiling Buddha for India. The test was about security. China had gone nuclear a decade earlier, and Pakistan was pursuing its own program. But for the US, it was an act of defiance. Washington reacted with anger, imposing sanctions and pushing for international restrictions on nuclear technology transfers. This tension reached its peak in 1998, when India carried out a series of nuclear tests at Pokhran, openly declaring itself a nuclear power. Instead of recognizing India's security concerns, especially with two nuclear-armed rivals on its borders, the US once again slapped heavy sanctions. Aid was cut off, military sales frozen, and India found itself isolated by much of the West. But here's the irony. Those sanctions didn't cripple India. They fueled self-reliance. Indian scientists doubled down, building indigenous nuclear and missile technology. The very restrictions meant to slow India actually pushed it toward technological independence. Meanwhile, U.S. defense contractors, who could have been supplying India's growing military, lost decades of lucrative contracts, which instead went to Russia, France, and later Israel. Fast forward to today, the U.S. now actively courts India as a nuclear ally, especially against China's rise. Agreements like the U.S. India's civil nuclear deal of 2008 mark a complete reversal in Washington's stance, but the scars of mistrust linger. Indian policymakers still remember how the U.S. punished them for prioritizing national security. For America, the cost of those sanctions wasn't just lost contracts, it was losing credibility with a nation that could have been a natural strategic partner. Trade and economic blindness. For much of the 20th century, Washington viewed India through a dismissive lens, too poor, too bureaucratic, too chaotic for serious economic engagement. The U.S. was fixated on China as the factory of the world, pouring investment and manufacturing into Beijing while largely ignoring New Delhi. It was a short-sighted gamble. When India liberalized its economy in 1991, slashing tariffs, deregulating industries, and opening up foreign investment, the world saw an opportunity. Japan, South Korea, and even European firms began exploring India's vast consumer base, but American companies were slow. They preferred China's centralized efficiency and infrastructure to India's messy democracy. The result? While China became the world's workshop, America missed the chance to build deep roots in India's growing economy. This blind spot proved costly in multiple sectors. In telecom, European companies like Nokia and Ericsson built early market share while U.S. firms lagged. In manufacturing, Germany and Japan supplied machinery and automobiles. In retail, it was years before Walmart and Amazon made serious entries into India, long after others had built footholds. And while China dominated electronics and supply chains, U.S. firms hesitated, only to find themselves scrambling decades later. Today, the landscape has changed. Apple assembles iPhones in India, Tesla is negotiating to set up a plant, and Google is investing billions into Indian startups and digital infrastructure. But this is all catch-up. Imagine if these moves had been made in the 1990s. America could have locked in decades of influence, trade dominance, and goodwill. Instead, that space was partially filled by China, which exported massive amounts of goods to India while also exploiting global markets that America could have captured with India as a partner. The cost of economic blindness. The U.S. forfeited early mover advantage in the world's largest democracy. Today, Washington is playing catch-up in a country whose economy is expected to become the world's third largest within a decade. IT boom and the brain drain if there's one area where America both gained and lost from underestimating India, it's technology. In the 1990s, as the IT outsourcing boom began, American companies initially resisted. Many dismissed India's engineers as cheap labor rather than top-tier talent, but soon they had no choice. India's IT workforce proved too valuable to ignore. Companies like Infosys, Wipro, and TCS became global giants, handling software development, customer support, and back-office operations for Fortune 500 firms. Entire sectors of U.S. business, from banking to healthcare, became dependent on Indian outsourcing. What started as cost-saving became a structural reliance. But the bigger story was the brain drain. Hundreds of thousands of Indian engineers and scientists moved to the U.S., studying at top universities and filling critical roles in Silicon Valley. Instead of recognizing this as a strategic advantage, America took it for granted. Over time, Indian-born leaders rose to the top. Sundar Pichai at Google, Satya Nadella at Microsoft, Arvind Krishna at IBM, and many more. Their leadership transformed not just their companies, but also global tech itself, the cost for America. While U.S. companies benefited, they also inadvertently boosted India's soft power. Today, the success of Indian-origin CEOs is a source of pride in India, reinforcing its global influence. At the same time, India developed its own IT and startup ecosystem, becoming a direct competitor in areas like AI, fintech, and cybersecurity. Instead of controlling India's IT rise, the U.S. now finds itself competing with it. In other words, what America once dismissed as outsourcing turned into a global shift, with India not just supporting U.S. companies, but building rivals of its own. Ignoring India's geopolitical leverage for decades, Washington looked east toward the Pacific. China, Japan, and Korea dominated American strategic thinking. The Indian Ocean, through which nearly half of the world's container traffic and energy shipments flow, barely registered on U.S. radar. Yet India, sitting at the heart of this ocean, had the power to shape trade and security in ways the U.S. failed to grasp. India controls vital sea lanes that connect the Middle East's oil fields to East Asia's manufacturing hubs. Whoever holds influence here can effectively shape the flow of global energy. But instead of building a long-term partnership with India, the U.S. largely ignored it. Washington's ships patrolled the Pacific. Its diplomats focused on East Asia. This left a vacuum. China quickly recognized the opportunity. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing poured billions into ports, pipelines, and infrastructure across South Asia, from Sri Lanka's Hambantota port to Pakistan's Gwadar. These projects weren't just about economics. They were about encircling India and projecting Chinese influence into the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, India deepened ties with Russia and Iran, keeping options open in the absence of U.S. partnership. The cost to America was clear: weak influence in South Asia, limited say in critical shipping lanes, and missed chances to shape security architecture in the Indian Ocean. Only recently has the U.S. scrambled to catch up, forming the Quad alliance with Japan, Australia, and India, and promoting its Indo-Pacific strategy. But for India, the memory of decades of neglect lingers. America is now playing catch-up in a region where India has already learned to stand on its own. Cultural and soft power miscalculations, geopolitics, and trade weren't the only blind spots. The U.S. also misjudged India's soft power, the cultural, social, and human influence that extends beyond economics or military might. For years, India was stereotyped as poverty, slums, and chaos. Washington underestimated the cultural depth and global reach that India would one day command. Take Bollywood. Indian cinema now reaches audiences from Africa to the Middle East to Europe. The world's appetite for Bollywood music, dance, and storytelling has grown massively, shaping perceptions of India far beyond its borders. Then there's yoga and Ayurveda, once dismissed as fringe, now billion-dollar industries in the West. Even cricket, with India's IPL league, has become a global entertainment giant, rivaling American sports in revenue and viewership. But perhaps the most overlooked asset was the Indian diaspora. Today, over 5 million Indians live in the U.S., making them one of the most educated and affluent immigrant groups. They hold influential roles in technology, academia, medicine, and increasingly, politics. Indian Americans donate to campaigns, shape public opinion, and occupy leadership positions across both parties. Yet for decades, Washington treated the diaspora as outsiders rather than a bridge between nations. The cost? America underestimated the power of people-to-people connections. Instead of cultivating these communities early, it let suspicion and stereotypes fester. Now, the irony is that Indian Americans are some of the biggest drivers of U.S.-India cooperation, a force Washington never anticipated. India's soft power today isn't just about culture. It's about influence, credibility, and networks that extend deep into American society. The turning point, post-2000s realignment. By the early 2000s, Washington began to realize it had gotten India wrong. The trigger, China's rise. As Beijing's power grew, America finally saw New Delhi not as a problem, but as the counterweight it desperately needed. The 2005 U.S.-India's civil nuclear deal was a watershed. For the first time, Washington recognized India as a responsible nuclear power, effectively reversing decades of sanctions and mistrust. This agreement didn't just unlock nuclear cooperation, it symbolized a strategic reset. Defense deals, joint military exercises, and technology transfers followed. Trade ties deepened too. American giants like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and General Electric began striking billion-dollar contracts with India. Silicon Valley poured investments into India's digital ecosystem. Diplomatically, India went from being on the margins to being at the center of America's Indo-Pacific strategy. But here's the catch: all of this came late. While Washington spent decades ignoring or sanctioning India, China surged ahead, building manufacturing dominance and buying influence globally. By the time America embraced India, Beijing was already challenging U.S. primacy. Had Washington built trust with India in the 1960s or 1970s, the global balance of power might look very different today. The cost of delay was not just lost contracts or influence. It was losing precious time in shaping Asia's future. The U.S. today sees India as a partner, but India, scarred by decades of neglect, insists on strategic autonomy. Washington's window to mold India's choices closed long ago. The price America paid so. What did all these misjudgments cost the United States? The price is steep, measured in lost alliances, lost markets, and lost influence. First, there's the strategic loss. By choosing Pakistan during the Cold War and punishing India for nuclear tests, Washington pushed New Delhi straight into Moscow's arms. For decades, the Soviet Union and later Russia supplied India's military hardware and supported it diplomatically. America could have had a natural democratic ally in Asia, but instead handed that role to its rivals. Second, the economic loss. U.S. companies were slow to enter India's markets, leaving room for European and Asian competitors. While America poured investment into China, it missed out on the early growth of what is now one of the world's largest consumer markets. Today, U.S. firms are scrambling to catch up, but they are decades late. Third, the cultural and soft power gap. Washington underestimated India's diaspora and global influence. Instead of seeing Indian immigrants as bridges, it sidelined them. The result? America missed decades of stronger cultural diplomacy that could have fostered trust and goodwill much earlier. Finally, the political cost. India today refuses to be anyone's junior partner. It buys oil from Russia despite U.S. pressure, balances ties with Iran, and carves its own path in global politics. Had Washington built trust earlier, India might have leaned closer to America today. Instead, New Delhi's mantra is clear. It will work with the US, but on its own terms. The irony is stark. After decades of misjudging India as weak, chaotic, or irrelevant, America now courts it desperately, not out of generosity, but out of necessity to counter China. The US could have had a loyal ally. Instead, it now has an independent power that cooperates when it chooses and resists when it must. Lessons and reflections. The story of America's misjudgment of India is not just about policy errors. It's about underestimating potential. Washington looked at India's poverty and struggles and assumed weakness. What it failed to see was resilience, a democracy that survived despite immense odds, an economy that reformed when it mattered, and a society that leveraged its diaspora to expand global influence. The lesson for America and the world is simple: never underestimate a nation based on today's struggles. India's rise shows that long-term factors like demographics, democracy, and innovation can transform a country once dismissed as irrelevant into a global heavyweight. For India, the lesson is equally powerful. Self-reliance pays off. Sanctions and neglect forced it to build indigenous capabilities in defense, nuclear power, IT, and space. Those very pressures turned into pillars of strength. For viewers, this story is a reminder that history is full of missed opportunities. America's biggest mistake was failing to see what India could become. The cost wasn't just to Washington's influence, but to the global balance of power. Closing, call to action. So, what does this all mean today? America misjudged India in the Cold War, in nuclear strategy, in trade, and in culture. The price: lost influence, lost markets, and a lost ally. Instead of nurturing one of the world's largest democracies, Washington pushed it toward others and missed its chance to shape a rising giant. Now, India is not just rising, it is reshaping the global order. From technology to trade, from defense to diplomacy, it is no longer a follower, it is a leader. And the irony is that America, which once dismissed India, now needs it more than ever to counterbalance China. The real lesson here isn't just about America and India, it's about how nations see each other. Misjudging potential may be the most expensive mistake of all. So let me ask you, do you think the US can rebuild the trust it lost with India, or has that ship already sailed? If you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned for our next video: why India may be America's last great ally against China.